This is our panel on the university. We're going to cover higher education and teaching and programs and centers and administration and activism in an hour. The panelists are Harold Shapiro, who's the president emeritus of Princeton, who's a professor of economics, and he's a thinker, a really good thinker on higher education. Jessica Green here is a political scientist at NYU's Environmental Studies Department. She's on her way to Canada, unfortunately. And she's a member of our climate change working group. And Jacob Lipton runs a program on policy innovation at the Harvard Law School, where he combines academic law and lawyers and activists and policy and everything we need to change the world. Okay.
Thank you. I've learned from long experience. I teach some classes here that go for 3 or 4 hours at a time, and there's always a break in between. That it's impossible to prevent that break from expanding after many, many decades of teaching. So you didn't quite make it coffee, no break. Okay, let me tell you what I'm going to take a particular perspective on this, which I hope is helpful to the discussion we're having. And I did enjoy many, many of the comments that are made here today and learned a great deal. I'm surprised to find myself here because I made a commitment to myself years ago that I would not appear after 3 o'clock at any conference.
That's a good
so here
rule.
I am.
That's a good rule.
Yeah, well.
I broke that rule. But in any case, I want to thank the organizers for getting us together. It's been very, very stimulating in many ways. My background as it relates to issues of public policy, whether it's in climate or other areas, is primarily one of what I would call sort of an ad hoc consultant. That is, I spent my entire career in one university or another. I've never had another kind of job other than in universities. And that's a different role than someone who's either full-time in one of the agencies or working in an administration. It's a whole different perspective. So my perspective is limited to someone who has spent many years testifying in various aspects of public policy, but have never actually been inside the administration, which gives one another perspective, another point of view, and another way of thinking about it. So my way of thinking about it is really very much conditioned upon my particular set of experiences. And as you can tell from some of the comments I made earlier today, and I'm only going to just mention it briefly now, I'm not going to go into it in any detail, is in this respect, in the public policy respect whether it's climate change or another important issue of public policy, I think institutions are really important. It's not natural for a scholar to think of institutions as important. It's much more natural to think of individuals as important. And individuals are very important and have a significant role. But I think one cannot really understand the policy space without understanding what role institutions occupy for themselves in that space. Very much to our benefit, but it's very often overlooked just how important these institutions are and how much they impact the evolution of policy. They're a center of enormous amount of expertise, quite aside from what universities may contain. And it's very important as we think about any public policy issue, but let's say climate change in particular, to understand what that institutional space is and how it's generating information and how it's informing various actors. Now, from my perspective, having served as a policy advisor in various subjects, I always think of policy as a competitive sport. This is a competitive sport when you're testifying, which has been my role principally, writing reports, testifying, trying to convince people of one thing or another. I always think of myself as engaged in a competitive sport. Now, in a competitive sport, what often happens in professional athletics? Okay, here's a competitive sport you normally think of. People are always breaking the rules, right? The competition drives you to the edge, and very often over the edge, as we all know. We can hardly open up the newspaper without seeing someone driven over the edge in competitive sports. And the same thing is true in the policy area. Okay? You have any time the government is considering any kind of significant approach to policy or any kind of policy, there are all kinds of advice. They are soliciting all kinds of advice that will contribute to that. And people, again, advisors very often, people who are asked for their opinion on various issues, are often also driven to the edge. You know, you all have a point of view. I remember the very first time I ever testified long ago now. This was in the those of you, I don't know how many were born in the 1960s, but I was testifying in the 1960s, and I'm testifying on the economic outlook, and there's someone from the UAW beside me over here, and someone else from the American Manufacturers Association over here, and they know exactly what it is that has to be done. And you're sitting there saying, well, look, there's got to be some uncertainty. After all, I know we don't know everything. There's all kinds of things that could happen. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty in this world. And I'm faced with the very early on, the moral decision is, do I adopt my own lack of, or my own certainty in order to compete with these people? Or do I try in my ineffective way to tell them, well, maybe it's this way and maybe it's that way? And you know all of the jokes about economists, it could be this way, it could be that way, and so on. But that is a real problem faced by academics who are looking to impact the policy arena. Okay. The question is, we know it's full of uncertainty. We know there's uncertainty of all kinds that surround even our understanding of the natural world, let alone its evolution over time. And the question is whether we can get people to understand that uncertainty is an inevitable part of the human experience here. Whether at the individual level or at the societal level, uncertainty is just built into this thing. And can we get people to accept this when you're in a competitive sport, as I said a few moments ago? And that's a constant moral challenge, I think, those of us from academic life who are trying our best to inform public policy in ways that we think are effective and are important, and yet have to deal with this issue of uncertainty. As it came up earlier today, the issue of the difference between not knowing everything and knowing nothing. Okay, and that occupying that space is really a very, very difficult and challenging issue. Now, I want to turn to the what I consider, I guess, the moral aspects of dealing with it, whether it's in climate change or it's something else. What we say and what we advise impacts people's lives if we're lucky. Okay, so if we are recommending any particular action, whether it's on issues of nuclear arms control or it's issues of climate or any other issues like that, our recommendations, our positions will impact people's lives. That gives us an enormous moral obligation to deal with. We have issues of uncertainty before us. If we do impact people's lives, we are really going to have to take that very seriously. And the question we have to ask ourselves, and I think don't ask ourselves often enough, is what exactly are our moral obligations in this arena? So let me take an example. Well, we can take it from climate change, but let me take an example that puts together climate change and economics. I was trained initially in economics and mathematics, so let me take an example from that. So you want to, I guess the carbon tax came up, at least it came up in a comment today, which is probably the economist's favorite recommendation in the area of climate change, how to get people to economize on exploiting fuels and so on and so forth. What's the moral question here? The moral question is whose lives are going to be impacted by that? It's not enough to say that, you know, we think that an effective, efficient way to deal with climate change is, let's say, by a carbon tax of some kind or another. Well, that carbon tax impacts different people in our society in different ways. There are winners and losers in any change we're going to make. And we have an obligation, not often executed in my judgment, if we are people from academic life trying to do our best to impact public policy, to help inform the Congress or the administration, as the case may be, on what is the moral content of what we're saying, by which I mean a very particular thing, namely who is the winner and who is the loser in this particular public policy that we might be suggesting. To me, that is a critically important thing and often overlooked. So to speak about things perhaps I know most about, which is testifying on economic issues, I don't know how many times I have testified on issues regarding whether GMP is going to go up or down and which we should do and all that, and that's hard enough as it is, and we're sometimes correct, sometimes not correct. But it as a whole, we very seldom hear anyone talk about whose lives are impacted by that. If I make a recommendation regarding whether it's a tax, a carbon tax, or it's something about increasing government spending or anything of that nature, it has distributional impacts that impact the justice of the society that we're carrying forward. And to me, that is an extremely important and the most overlooked area regarding the impact of scholars as they try to impact public policy. So there's all kinds, many of my colleagues here at Princeton and all the other universities that are represented around here have colleagues who testify constantly or at least regularly over time. But in my view, it's too often overlooked just what the justice implications of all these things are. One final comment, because it is 3 o'clock or later on a Saturday afternoon. The scholars trying to impact public policy tend to have fairly long-term views on matters. People actually acting on public policy have short-term views. It's the nature of the political system that we lived on. There's just that conflict between how a scholar might look at it and how a congressperson may look at it and how a government administration or administrative apparatus of government may try to implement something. The time frames are just all different. And that's something which I think has we've got to find some way to bridge that gap, which is more effective than it has been so far. So I do think in our particular society, in the US, and others can speak about other kinds of countries, scholars do have a voice. They have their own individual voice. They have a collective voice, as we've heard this morning, about how scholars can get together and try to articulate a particular policy, a particular approach, a particular concern they have. And what I find missing most of all in all these things is when you do have a suggestion going forward, just who it is who are going to be the winners, who are going to be the losers in that, because it's always the case that you can't escape that. And it seems to me that that's something that we should all be looking at together. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank quickly Nancy and Melissa because I don't want to take too much time, but it's really an honor to be on this panel, to come back to my alma mater and participate in this really important event with a very distinguished group. And I think my comments build quite nicely on my former professor Shapiro's about winners and losers. I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience. I'm actually having an identity crisis. I was raised in the academy. I learned to be objective. I learned to proceed incrementally, to immerse myself in the research of others, meticulously assembling modest, falsifiable hypotheses, and then dutifully reporting the sources of bias and the potential problems, and of course my findings. So I learned to be very analytical and scientific. And as a result, I feel like I've had all of the politics trained out of me. And instead of engaging in climate politics, I study them. Instead of advocating, I analyze. And this is my profession. And somehow I feel like I'm shirking my political responsibility, which is to do something. So the question is, what should I do? And I really enjoyed writing this talk because it made me think about what I should do. So what I'm going to do today is describe what I think advocacy should look like from where we sit in the academy. And some of these suggestions are a pronounced departure from the status quo. The academy is an inherently conservative institution, but addressing the existential threats of climate change is going to involve radical action and some fairly radical politics. So my comments will have 3 parts. First, I want to talk about how political scientists engage with the issue of climate change. And then I'll talk about the answers. So that's about the questions that we ask and we don't ask. And then I'll talk a little bit about the answers we give and the kind of answers we ought to give. And to the extent that we're thinking about climate change in my discipline of political science, our research is surprisingly and ironically apolitical. We've been taught to be what Roger Pielke Jr. calls, quote unquote, honest brokers. So expanding the scope of choice for decision makers so that they can make choices based on their preferences, interests, and values. And I'm going to argue that the time for being an honest broker has passed. The existential threat of climate change requires that we use our expertise and our position of extraordinary privilege in the academy to advocate for solutions rather than to just lay out the options. So our job going forward is to lay bare the entrenched economic interests that prevent governments from decarbonizing our society. And I think this is going to be a pitched battle, and yet we often see it through the lens of technocratic management, and I think this is a mistake. So, and then finally, I'll talk about how we should do advocacy. And it's not necessarily rewarded by the academy, but we should be engaging in politics, not just studying them. By merely providing our views, by not expressing our views about what should be done, we're passing the buck. We absolve ourselves of the responsibility of wrestling with the kinds of difficult political and ethical questions that Harold was just talking about. And so instead, I think we should embrace the reality that the scale of societal change that is needed means that there's going to be conflict. So I'll talk a little bit about the questions that we ask in political science, and this is a little bit inside baseball to my discipline, so I'll be very brief, but I think it's important to underscore the fact that there's surprisingly little research on climate change in the discipline of political science. So I published a study with a colleague last year where we wanted to find out just how much research on climate change was going on in our subfield of international relations. So we used data from a survey of international relations faculty in the US, and in 2014, only 3.2% of US IR faculty identified the environment as their primary area of study. And yet, more than half of the faculty surveyed ranked climate change as one of the top 3 foreign policy issues. We analyzed data from the top 12 journals, international relations journals, and we found that between 1980 and 2012, 1.2% were related to the environment. And you won't be surprised then to discover that my colleague and I had a lot of difficulty actually getting this paper published. So the point is here, at least in my discipline, we're not studying this problem as much as we should be, let alone advocating around it. And I'd be happy to talk about more why this is, but I just want to flag that for right now. So now I want to talk about a discussion of the answers that we give and the answers that we ought to give. So there are a lot of important questions about policy design in climate change. So will renewables provide enough energy? How can we leverage storage? How do we transform our energy grids? But the real questions are political questions. Powerful actors benefit tremendously, indeed in some cases beyond our capacity to imagine, from the continued combustion of fossil fuels. Some of these actors are firms, others are governments. And decarbonization is going to create winners and losers. And the potential losers are going to fight very hard to maintain the status quo. Indeed, most oil-producing nations have doubled down on production. Canada, my future country, is committed to extraction of oil and tar sands in Alberta. Prime Minister Trudeau continues to back a controversial pipeline expansion to support Alberta, despite objections from other provinces. The US is similarly expanding oil production. Our oil exports are at record levels, and we continue to open up vast swaths of public lands and offshore sites for more exploration. In a particularly retrograde move, US Energy Secretary Rick Perry recently proposed specious revisions to energy market regulations to forestall the closure of coal-fired power plants. And FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, struck down this proposal, arguing that the closures would not threaten grid reliability as Perry had claimed. So there are winners and losers all over the place. In Florida, the Sunshine State, major utility companies spent more than $20 million to defeat a proposed constitutional amendment to incentivize the expansion of rooftop solar. They lost 51% to 49%, despite deliberately misleading language in the amendment. Given that 66% of Floridians support a state mandate for renewables, which is above the national average, this just shows how clear entrenched interests are and their outsized influence on politics, and how they're undermining the will of the electorate. So when we consider the types of answers we ought to be giving with respect to climate change, we need to think very seriously about the power of the political and economic forces that stymie current efforts at change. So this means we have to remain focused on defining and understanding the root of the problem, entrenched economic and political interests. And although I almost surprise myself at saying so, technocratic solutions are not what's needed. Political solutions are. So I suggest we should engage in what political scientist Richard Falk, and Princeton faculty member, calls, quote, value-oriented scholarship and advocacy. And this means thinking about climate change as a normative rather than as a technical problem. And for me personally, this means pushing back against the logic of incrementalism and trying to theorize transformative political change. It means, as Falk suggests, encouraging, quote, radical critique of political, economic, cultural, and ideological structures, end quote. I make the distinction between technocratic and normative because there are a lot of political science scholars who are engaged in policy discussions in the public sphere. And increasingly, our discipline is building institutions to facilitate this engagement. And I think that's a good thing. So we have, like, for example, the Bridging the Gap project at American University seeks to, quote, equip professors and doctoral students with the skills they need to produce influential, policy-relevant research and theoretically grounded policy work. So they do media trainings and all this kind of stuff. And there are a growing number of scholars who do this policy work that so they're directing their scholarship not only inward to their discipline, but outward to broader audiences. And I think this is a positive trend, even though it goes largely unrecognized by the academy. But I have developed some reservations about this conception of advocacy, and this is a lot of what this kind of advocacy is a lot of what we've been talking about today. Not because of the mode, but rather because of the kind of content that it produces. So to be an engaged scholar who is doing this kind of outward-facing work, we have to produce mainstream work, right? Politically feasible proposals and reasonable critiques. But I worry that the dictates of political feasibility and incrementalism can be insidious, leading to a narrowing of our political imagination at the precise moment when an expansion is urgently needed. So the examples about Canada and Florida and FERC show that the political challenges are vast, and they underscore why our responsibility is not just to be honest brokers, but to pick a side, right? To lay bare the entrenched economic interests that prevent us from decarbonization. So I think we have to, how we do this in practice, I'm going to make 3 suggestions. First, we have to clarify power relations and the power asymmetries that are in place. We need to dispel the notion that there is a technocratic response that can paper over profoundly different material interests. Second, I think we need to be wary of plausibility as a defining criterion. So Lee Foote and colleagues describe advocacy as the process of, quote, comparing the most plausible of a collection of possible propositions, explanations, or descriptions of an issue, and then lending one's active support to the ideas, policies, or proposals that are interpreted by the research, end quote. So policy is the art of the possible, but politics is not. If we focus on climate change as a fundamental problem of redistribution, who are the winners and losers, rather than one of technocracy, plausibility should not guide our thinking. And then finally, as individual scholars, we should plant a flag. We need to think about what our political commitments are, and then we need to be explicit about them. We should not be honest brokers, but rather issue advocates, be transparent and forthcoming about what our beliefs and our proposals are. So I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to say a little bit more about what each of these is. So on power relations, for the technocrat, climate change is a puzzle. We have the technology to decarbonize, and yet we are not even remotely near implementing the policies that adequately address the existential threat of climate change. So why is that? The answer is carbon lock-in. So carbon lock-in creates increasing returns to inefficient policies, and subsequently the beneficiaries of those policies organize to preserve them. So fossil fuel subsidies are a useful example. Globally, at the same time that we're trying to move to net zero emissions, globally countries are spending upwards of $5 trillion subsidizing fossil fuels, right? So why can't we get rid of these obviously inefficient policies? Because producers and consumers would both face increased prices if they were withdrawn, and so politicians are therefore reluctant to withdraw these benefits, which is exacerbated by the time horizon problem that Harold pointed out. So beneficiaries of carbon lock-in fear that decarbonization is going to affect their access to resources, their profitability, and in turn, their ability to wield power. So they become organized blocks of opposition. So in order to deal with this, we have to change these power relations in society. And if we're going to do this, advocates will be needed on every level of governance and in the public sphere. So one principle to guide our advocacy, I'm suggesting, is to spend less time on the technical aspects of cooperation and more on the fundamental conflicts of interest that prevent decarbonization. So the perils of plausibility. In 2004, some of you may be familiar with this, two members of the US environmental advocacy movement wrote a provocative piece called The Death of Environmentalism. And in it, they argued that the environmental advocacy community had become overly focused on solutions that were politically feasible, and as a result, had become incapable of articulating a broader vision for change, and the political allies needed to achieve it. I worry that as scholars, we too might fall victim to a similar trap. Studying incremental approaches to mitigation, by studying these incremental approaches, we inadvertently validate them, skewing our focus towards short-term, small-bore wins when we should be considering long-term, large-scale transformational change. So of course we need all hands on deck at this point. We should be developing a portfolio of approaches, some short-term and some longer-term. But here I want to stick my neck out a little and say that we need to be asking more ambitious questions. It's useful to know that feed-in tariffs work particularly well in democracies, or that democracies are more committed to mitigation policies than autocracies. But we also need to think more radically at the types of questions that will get to the root of the problem. So how do we disrupt carbon lock-in and the entrenched interests it produce? How can we delegitimize fossil fuels, build broad coalitions, change societal norms? These are things about which our discipline and the academy should have something to say. And to be fair, there are some scholars who are working on these questions, but not nearly enough. And at least in my discipline, they certainly don't represent the mainstream. So in The Death of Environmentalism, the authors give a vivid account of how incrementalism can neuter even the best-intentioned advocacy. So in 2003, the Senate voted down the first of 3 federal efforts to regulate greenhouse gas emissions through a cap-and-trade scheme. One member of a major US environmental advocacy organization spun the loss into a win, stating, quote, "It's a start. This may seem to be a defeat now, but in the end, it's a victory. A bill that gets at least 40 votes has a fair chance of passing if it's reintroduced." Well, it was reintroduced twice, and we're still awaiting a federal policy on greenhouse gas emissions. So this isn't to take pot shots at the environmental community, but to illustrate how incrementalism can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Small-bore solutions will not necessarily accumulate into larger ones. Rather, many of these victories will be temporary, lasting only until entrenched interests wield material power to revert to the status quo. So incrementalism is a constant battle of inches with both forward progress and regression. We need to think bigger than that. And my final point is one that might seem obvious. We need to plant flags. We need to develop scholarly political identities. And this is something I personally have struggled with. I'm surprised at the extent to which my colleagues see their role as analysts. Their defining characteristic is to expand or clarify the scope of choice for decision-making, as Pielke describes. And this is a way that allows the decision maker to reduce choice based on his or her own preferences or values. But being an honest broker, as Pielke describes, is the opposite of being an advocate. It is a doctrinal unwillingness to engage in any sort of conflict over interests, values, or preferences. And yet this is largely what we are trained to do as experts. So there's a norm, I think, at least I have perceived in my brief career in the academy, that advocacy is uncouth. To plant a flag or to take a stand is to sully one's identity as an expert, right? And we've talked about how do you maintain your own legitimacy and your claims to expertise while engaging in advocacy. And this is a very difficult question, but I think that being an advocate and an expert should not be mutually exclusive, and that rather we need to think of this as our responsibility, again, as Harold elaborated nicely, not just to produce a menu of options, but offer our own views. And I think there are stakes to the political phenomena we study, and choosing not to have a view based on our expertise is abdicating responsibility. And that abdication of responsibility is a choice that often works in favor of powerful interests and against those who are seeking to reorganize power relations. So introducing our views doesn't tip the scales in any way, but rather injects further plurality into the debate. So I'm going to conclude with a couple of examples of what I've done to be an advocate within the profession. So I've tried to do outward-looking advocacy in a couple of ways. I do some media work, news and radio appearances, which, again, are not counted towards my scholarly productivity, but reach hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that this should be recognized within the academy, right? Indeed, making complex ideas readily digestible for a lay audience is perhaps the most difficult kind of teaching. Right? One that should be recognized not only as a public service, but also as evidence of excellence in teaching. I write opinion pieces, so I've published work in Nature and Nature Climate Change that's been very critical of carbon markets, which is not a popular opinion, but I think it's a very important one. And I think these are types of journals that allow us to reach a broad interdisciplinary audience, and they have formats that are conducive to staking out a position. And then finally, I try to advocate within the discipline in a number of ways. I've been pushing for a more political research agenda, one that seeks to overcome carbon lock-in rather than incremental policies. I've done this in some of my own scholarship and in conferences and in other interactions that I have with the field. With a group of co-conspirators, I'm also pushing for more political scientists to study climate change. I participate in the Social Science Research Council climate group that is dealing with this problem and has spurred me to work with other junior scholars to think about how to fix this problem. And finally, I teach students that they have important decisions to make about how they engage with the world, and I push them to develop and elaborate their own views. So ironically, the Academy is yet another institution that is ill-equipped to deal with climate change. It's conservative to the core. It is resistant to valuing, I think, some of the needed advocacy that its members should engage in, and I hope that these comments have provided some insights about how we might go about changing that. Thank you.
So I want to start by thanking Nancy and Melissa for bringing me here, allowing me to be part of this workshop and on this panel, which I'm even more thrilled about now I've heard what my fellow panelists have to say, which I endorse wholeheartedly, as you'll see. I think one way of describing what I'm about to do is to say that I want to apply everything that Jessica just said about the Academy as it relates to policymakers and setting up a menu of options that policymakers can then make their choices based on their preferences, and say it's exactly the same with respect to students with the teaching role of the Academy, and that Academy also shouldn't see their role as setting out a menu of options for students to then pursue careers based on their preferences. I'll come back and that'll become clearer, I think. So I'll start by talking a little bit about how I came to climate activism and the trajectory I went on, and then how I see that relating to the norms of legal academia and teaching and what I do about it. And this is based on the idea that I have that the norms of the legal profession are to a large extent not embedded in the codes of legal ethics that you've heard a little bit about already, but are implicit and are imparted implicitly as part of legal education. And that's a huge amount of what's going on, and so we have to study that as well if we want to understand the norms of the legal profession. My first serious involvement in climate activism was when I was a law student at Harvard, where I still am at Harvard now. I co-direct the Systemic Justice Project, and you'll hear more what that is. And I got involved in climate activism, and specifically in pushing Harvard to divest from fossil fuels, partly because of my view that while I was there, I had a tremendous opportunity to influence an institution that could then have even more influence. Partly from reading books like Eco Republic and Merchants of Doubt right around that time that I was going into law school, and partly because during law school I experienced a loss of faith in the legal system, a loss of a sense that the legal system kind of had this covered. It seemed increasingly arbitrary and captured to me, and that capturing applied to courts, to administrative agencies, but also to law schools themselves. And so three quick moments in that trajectory I experienced in law school that I'll then refer back to. One was during my first year of law school. I had this experience of watching public interest drift in a huge proportion of my classmates. So a large proportion of my classmates came in with kind of public interest aspirations, and by the end of the first year had lost those. And I became active in an organization called Firmly Refuse, trying to encourage people to not go to big law firms. It was not very successful at all. One of our strategies was to put up posters where we just described some of the cases that many of the big law firms that students are going to took on. Many of those ended up being environmental cases, so we had a big poster saying that Kirkland and Ellis defended BP in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Kelly Dry were on the side of Union Carbide in the Bhopal disaster. Quinn Emanuel represented Shell in Kiobel in the destruction of the Niger Delta. Gibbs and Dunn defended Chevron, and they're spilling billions of tons of toxic waste in the Amazon. These are the cases these law firms, which are the main big law firms that many students are going to, took on. So that was one moment, was that activism I became involved in. The second moment was an environmental law course I took with a lovely professor who I admire greatly. And in that course, I learned that environmental law is about as taught in law schools, is about the details of litigation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, NEPA, CERCLA, RCRA. And I think that's really important and vital, and it needs to be taught in law schools. But that was it for environmental law for the vast majority of students. So most students don't take any environmental law classes, and the vast majority of ones who do take that one. And there was this professor is someone who's done a lot of incredible litigation and work, and has been is a hero of the environmental movement in many ways. But there was nothing about which side students were going to be on, and I think the majority of students in that course were going to go and work at corporate law firms and be on the wrong side of these issues from my perspective and from that teacher's perspective. And there was no discussion about that. And no discussion of climate change, really. I mean, it came up as we were discussing maths for EPA, but if you wanted to learn about climate change, there was a clinic you could take, which had a very small number of students, and a seminar. Some years it's offered and some years it isn't, where there's discussions of climate change. But the vast majority of students aren't going to be exposed to that. And so my focus is really not on the students who go on and do incredible work as environmental lawyers on the right side, but on the rest of students. So that's the second moment. And then the third moment was a professional ethics and responsibility course, which is required. Everyone has to take one. And where you basically learn that it's all about zealous advocacy for your client. There's nothing in the rules about client selection or how you should think about your responsibility about who your clients are. And this has tremendous repercussions for issues of access to justice, where the vast majority of people in this country can't afford a lawyer or have any access to courts whatsoever, while the resources of the legal profession are almost all targeted towards a very, very small slice of the country. And separate from that course, but just the kind of the norms that were imparted through law school, the jokes you heard around campus were things like, if you want to pass the required professional ethics and responsibility exam, you just ask which, and it's multiple choice, which rule, if generalized, is in the best interest of the legal profession, and that's pretty much right. And so that's just the fact of the professors making those kind of jokes is imparting norms as well. So those are three moments, and that led me to become involved in Divest Harvard and Students for Sustainable Investment at law school, a law school student group, and participate in sit-ins and blockades and teach-ins and discussions about how the legal system should address climate change, which was the only place I had those discussions in law school. Now, before quickly talking about what I do now kind of in teaching, I want to say just a little bit about my sense of what the norms of legal education are, which maps very well onto what was discussed in the last panel on the presuppositions and the way of thinking that both Samuel Zakharov and Justice Benjamin were talking about. And I would say that some of these norms and the presuppositions are kind of implicit in the law, but a huge portion of them as well are passed through legal education, and they're actually the norms of legal education that then that's how they become the norms of the legal profession. So to oversimplify into four norms of legal education, one is that legal education is basically about what the law is, not what the law could be or should be, but it's basically about what the law is. The second is that legal education tends to presume the legitimacy of the law. It's not that most law professors will have some ideas of laws that should be changed, but basically it's taught, here's the law and you're learning it as if it's a good thing. Thirdly, legal education tends to presume the legitimacy of the categories and silos of the law, so you learn it almost entirely. You learn property law and contracts law and tort law and criminal law and constitutional law and so on, all in narrow silos and with very little examination of how the system works as a whole. And fourth, legal education tends to be individualistic in both form and substance. So in form, that you're sitting in a class, as a student sitting in a classroom by yourself, and you take an exam by yourself, there's very little collaboration and teamwork. Clinics, there are exceptions to this, but that's the norm. And in substance, and this is part of the presuppositions that were discussed in the last panel, you're studying law as dispute resolution between two parties, and you want to look for a plaintiff and you want to look for a defendant. And that's not the only way of thinking about the law. We can think about how the law is structuring the background rules, is structuring the systems. There are other ways of doing it, but that's the way that's dominant in law schools, and I think then in the legal profession. And what's notable about these four aspects or presumptions of legal education is that all of them are terrible if you want to address a problem like climate change. They're starting with what the law is something that has failed to address climate change, isn't doing very well at the moment. In terms of presuming legitimacy, see point 1. As we've heard from several people today, any solutions are going to have to be interdoctrinal, inter-silo within different silos of the legal system and beyond the silos of the legal system. And as we heard in the last panel, it's a case where looking for individualized harm is very difficult and not amenable to solution through that. And I think in some ways the environmental law class I took epitomized some of these norms, and there are good reasons for some of them. I don't have time to go into the pros and cons of them, but I'm not saying there are no pros, but I think there are real cons of them as well. And I think that they're training students. So we're training students in one type of thing, which is in the technical expertise to become, say, environmental lawyers, but we're not training students in how to address systemic problems. And we're also promoting a vision of the lawyering, which is at best the former, at best the kind of technical expertise, and actually very often the technical expertise in service of the wrong side, I'm happy to say. I'm sad to say it, but I'm happy to call it out as the wrong side. And I think this connects to a point that Naomi raised earlier about individualism and to a sense of stable preferences of policymakers and everyone else. And I think there is this idea that law students come in with this set of stable preferences. My impression from both being a law student and teaching law students is most law students come in with something of the good ethic that Robert Lipton talked about in the first session or this morning, kind of a vague idea that they want to use the law to do good, but a weak one, and that they can be taken off very easily. And law school, that's exactly what law school is doing, is taking people off that ethic. So an alternative vision and model of legal academic practice and legal practice does exist. At the moment I'm working on a piece unrelated to this, looking at a slice of legal scholarship from around 1972, 1973, and that includes work by Derek Bell, who took a leave of absence from Harvard Law School to protest their failure to hire a woman of color as a law professor. Includes Duncan Kennedy, who practiced rebellious lawyering as a professor, Catherine McKinnon as well. And then also looking back further at people like Charles Hamilton Houston, who a Harvard Law School graduate who was general counsel of the NAACP for a while, and the dean of Howard Law School, and had this vision of lawyers as either social engineers or parasites on society. So and then also Ralph Nader is another a great example of this, very focused on legal education. Edgar Kahn, who, with Jean Kahn, his wife, developed the idea of clinical legal education, which is a wonderful improvement in law schools over the past half century, but is also generally not aimed at systemic problems like climate change. So there is this alternative model within the legal academy. And the good news is that this alternative model is probably the dominant model that students have when they enter law school. So in classes that I co-teach, we survey all our students coming into law school about what the biggest problems they think are in the world. And climate change is always in the top three. It's the top three almost always climate change, mass incarceration, and income inequality or different types of inequality. And students almost all believe that law school should help teach students to address those problems, that should be one of the goals of law school. We survey students later on. That's a random sample of students. The later on ones are ones who self-select into our classes and are not random, but they almost all say that law school hasn't taught them those things. So that's one piece of the bad news. And the second piece of the bad news is that law school is in fact pushing away students from that vision. There's various pieces of that. One is the funding of legal education, the students leaving with a ton of debt, and so it's going to be much easier to go to a high-paying job. But there's also, I think, the implicit norms of law school are part of what's doing that work. And this idea of students as professors are just going to lay out kind of the option, here's what the law is, and students are going to have these very strong, stable preferences and stick with them. Actually, they don't have those stable preferences and are very easily pushed into other careers. There's been a lot of study by Robert Granfield, John Bliss, and others about how public interest drift happens, how students move away from coming in wanting to save the world and leave not doing that. John Bliss's recent research has looked at how you can map students' sense of their professional identity, and over the course of law school, the students who come in with a public interest orientation and leave without one move the identity as lawyer, as compared to other identities as family member or anything else, further and further from what they see as the core of their identity, so that by the time they leave, they think the lawyer is something that's almost external to their identity. Really, I'm a husband, a father, or whatever it is, and lawyer is just something I'm doing on the day job. Whereas the students who don't lose that orientation keep lawyer at the heart of their of their identity. So that's kind of what I think is happening in law school. So what am I doing about it? Well, I'll talk a little bit about my teaching. So I co-teach with Professor John Hanson a couple different courses. One is called Systemic Justice, and which the one-line summary of it is looking at power and inequality and the role of the law in legitimating it. We do a lot of history, looking at historical injustices. We bring in a lot of mind sciences. And we also, I run something called the Justice Lab, which operates like a think tank where students can select any problems they care about, and then in a team of 5, we'll write a policy paper, prepare presentations for a conference, and we supervise that and connect them with experts of different types, activists, lawyers, academics, and so on. And a big part of the goal of that is to allow students to recenter on the problems that they came to law school thinking about and caring about, but lose sight of in this kind of doctrinal push. So it's always problem-centric. It's always starting with big problems. And we also apply this in first-year courses. John teaches a torts class where we also give students a chance to work on problems in teams and write papers and make videos and so on. Many of the problems the students select are about the climate in various ways. So we had a team of students working on the role of the Chamber of Commerce in lobbying against climate change. We had a team of students working with the Government Accountability Project in producing a whistleblowing guide and training for federal science employees. So there's ones that are kind of quite focused on climate change in various ways. And then we also have something where we call initiatives, where every student is assigned to an initiative as well as their problem topic. So whatever the problem they're working on is, they also will be assigned to one of the initiatives which are either various forms of inequality, so gender and gender identity inequality, racial inequality, income inequality, and then the only one that's not an inequality is climate change. So one of the students is assigned to the whole semester be thinking about how does my topic, whatever it is, it could be something within the criminal justice system, it could be about amicus briefs, how does that connect to climate change? And we have a session where all the students from different teams are sitting together and thinking about how climate change relates to all the different topics they're working on. And then we also, as part of the teaching, try to impart different norms. So we brought our class on a field trip to a divest rally that was happening in Harvard Yard. We bring in spokespeople and speakers to speak to the class, often talking about climate change and talking about from different perspectives. So we had Kelsey Skaggs, who was a former student who I'll mention in a second, Craig Altamers from the Better Future Project, Naomi Oreskes has come and spoken to our class, Erin Henney's talking about system justification and the processing of climate change information. So we're trying to bring in that different model of thinking about the law as well. And outside of the classroom, I've done work to support a lawsuit with three of my students, along with students from a number of different other schools at Harvard, sued Harvard with some novel tort theories and some theories based on Harvard's 17th century corporate charter, arguing that Harvard had a duty to divest from fossil fuels, and I supported them in their research and commenting on drafts and mooted them before their appearance in Massachusetts courts, which I experienced as somewhat of a norm violation of supporting students and suing my employer, but also felt it was the right thing to do. Those students, the lawsuit didn't win, those students went on to start something called the Climate Defense Project when they graduated, and John and I gave them curricular space and credit to develop this idea and then supported them in applying for funding, which they were able to get. And they now have this organization based out of Oakland that defends climate activists with the idea of trying to make climate activism easier by being a backstop and saying there's always going to be someone, or as much as possible, who will defend you. They've been successful with some cases about the necessity to defense. They've done a lot of work with Keystone pipeline activists, trying to make activism easier. And then I've been involved in personal divest activism and continue to be involved with Divest Harvard in some ways since graduating. Back to teaching a little bit, a lot of our work is about trying to get students to think about the overlapping causes of problems, the systemic causes of all different problems they might be working on, whether it's climate change or income inequality or mass incarceration. And we have themes that keep coming up. One is system justification and thinking about mind sciences phenomena and the role of that. Another is capture, exactly on what Jessica was talking about. It's very easy to have students think about the capture, regulatory capture, that's very popular. It's also relatively easy to think about the capture of science and the role of fossil fuel companies in funding science. But we also want students thinking about the capture of legal education, the legal system, the legal profession, and precisely the professional norms and expectations of the legal profession, which I would say are also captured by corporate interests, including fossil fuel companies, but just more generally the law firms who defend them, and also on the wrong side of all kinds of other inequalities and injustices. So it's easy to see the ABA ethics rules as captured and as benefiting the legal profession and certain types of lawyering. And I would say the norms of legal education too are captured. And so the effects of this include that many students go into corporate law, as I've been talking about. But I want to mention one other type of effect, which is on the public interest side itself. So lawyers who don't experience public interest drift, who stick with their public interest orientation, there are still all kinds of norms about what is prestigious and what kind of careers they should go into, where, working for the Department of Justice is prestigious, and that's going to be something that students are interested in. Other types of work, like this climate defense activism or climate activist defense, is not experienced as prestigious and is much less likely that the students will go into it. And even more than the prestige, it's very hard to get funding for that. So most funding comes through law firms who fund postgraduate public interest fellowships as a kind of a civic duty, but they only are interested in funding direct representation in a kind of a legal aid context, which is, that's a very important work and it's good. They won't, but it's also not at all suited to tackling a problem like climate change. So something else I do is I'm the fellowships director of the Justice Catalyst, a new organization that is providing fellowships that's trying to provide a path for students like my students who started the Climate Defense Project. It's trying to fund fellowships for students who take on powerful interests, who are the clients of the law firms, who they'll certainly not sponsor you to take on with a systemic focus. and try to fulfill the promise of a legal education that promotes or at least doesn't dissuade from that kind of work. So that's what I'm doing in my kind of teaching capacity to try to model what I see as, to correct the flaws that I see in legal education.
We have some time for questions, but I thought I'd just seize the floor and make two observations. Jess and Melissa will remember that we had a conference here a few years ago where we invited young social scientists to present their work on climate change. And after all the papers were presented and so on and so forth, I think I raised the question, well, you know, how do you all feel actually about the politics of this, right, and advocacy?
This was 3 days after the election,
Right,
remember?
right, it was right, that's right. It was 3 days after. And the senior political scientist there said, no. You can't do that, right? You have to publish in the right journals. You have to do, you know, the things that qualify you for tenure. Then you have to have a reputation, and then you can leverage your reputation to do something for advocacy. And Jessica spoke up, I must say, against her thesis advisor. And we had a really very interesting conversation about it. So I thought, but things have not changed very much since then. You've been very successful, but for the most part, there are a lot of obstacles to success here. If Jacob's example of Derek Bell had been given at the time, people would have said, yes, but that's Derek Bell. Once you're Derek Bell, then you can go take a leave of absence to advocate. I think that it's an interesting question, which we don't have time to take up, why it's so hard to change the qualifications for good careers in academia. And there are very interesting answers to it, I think, that go beyond capture of law firms and so on. I think there's a kind of conservatism built into what qualifies as high-level academic work. Just one other observation. I think we've put together a group here that's an unusual mix. And not the least thing that's so unusual is the generational span. I mean, I'm not going to give away people's ages, but we really have quite a span. And I've observed, and I could be wrong because I didn't, do biographical checks or anything, that by and large, the more senior scholars here moved into climate change. And we've heard some stories, personal stories about how that happened. Of course, there may be one or two who were premature environmentalists, sort of like premature anti-communists, but for the most part, people change their careers. Whereas we're seeing now younger scholars who are doing this from the start. And the question is how they will be greeted by senior people in academia. Questions? Yeah.
These were wonderful presentations. I had a question for Harold, and it's really a qualification perhaps or a caveat. So in talking about winners and losers from policy changes, I would add that it's very important to think about winners and losers from the status quo, so
Sure.
to avoid the status quo bias, because I think otherwise one could easily feed it sort of in an unintended way. I just want to
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Robert.
Believe it or not, I want to continue with what was just raised by Melissa about winners and losers, because that was a theme through the panel. Yes, there are winners and losers in terms of every decision, every direction that's taken with climate change or not taken. But then if we step back, there's something wrong with that analysis. With climate change, it is so pervasive. We are all so threatened by it that if it proceeds, we're all losers. Even the hypocritical leadership of ExxonMobil begins to recognize that climate change, which they've lied about and falsified because they knew about it very early and then denied it and falsified it to their own stockholders and others, the general public, nonetheless, they have to begin to recognize that their function as a corporation will be impaired by the inexorable advance of the effects of climate change. Now, when does that begin to be politically significant? We don't know, and it's a difficult psychological question. When do people in this mixed self-evaluation, recognizing and at the same time rejecting climate change, when does the rejection become so absurd and threatening to their own interests that it no longer holds? This is a larger question, but I think it hovers over the panel on climate change in a way that it doesn't over other issues.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, anything that's existential to our existence has a whole different characteristic. I mean, I agree with that. I don't have any problem with that.
Can I just respond quickly? I mean, I think it's this is the sort of conundrum of, political scientists call this, and Harold described it, the time inconsistency problem. So yes, it's true we are all losers, right? But that's in the long run, right? So economists say in the long run, we're all dead. Right, but so there's an interesting thing in the Wall Street Journal today, and I think this fundamental power relations is important. There was a story about luxury doomsday preppers, right? So these are the super duper rich guys. So there's your average Joe doomsday prepper who has like 1,000 cans of Spam in his basement and an AK-47. But then there are the super duper rich guys who have
The AK-47 is to commit suicide after you've eaten all the Spam.
Before you've eaten it all.
the super duper rich guys who have an anthrax-proof SUV and all these kinds of things, right? And so in the short term, these people don't think, right? There is the cognitive dissonance. I'm not the behavioral psychologist here, right? But there is this notion that like, I'll be okay. I'm rich enough, or I can insulate myself, or I can go somewhere that I'll be okay. So I absolutely agree with you. But in the long run, we are all losers. But in the short term, some people are gonna be much less affected than others.
Dictators and oligarchs have always used their money and power
Right.
to avoid, deny, and prevent death.
Right.
If I have enough power, if I can build this survival community for myself and maybe my family, it's okay. The rest of the world can be destroyed.
Right.
Of course, that illusion can go just so far, and I'm suggesting we're reaching a moment where the illusions of that kind are being threatened.
I'd like to applaud the political activism of the last two speakers, but I do feel I need to defend the need for technical innovation, because after all,
Fair enough.
technology, dating back to the steam engine, is what got us into this situation, and technology, hopefully, particularly you mentioned energy storage, is going to provide solutions to get us out of it. So I think it's important too.
I agree.
So do I.
Josh.
Two quick observations and questions related to that. One is, we've heard about academics in relation to policy, in relation to research and political activism, and in relation to graduate training. No one said anything about teaching undergraduates and how that might, did you?
I only teach undergrads,
Okay.
so.
So I just would invite you to reflect more on how that features into our professional responsibility as professional witnesses who are witnessing professionals. And from my own experience of teaching undergraduates, one question that they have is relevant to this attack on incrementalism and attack on malignant normality that we've heard reiterated today, which I think is well taken. But at the same time, there does seem to be a need for some people, and hopefully good people, to man or woman or person the offices of the existing institutions. So a lot of students wonder, should we refuse to serve in government, given who's in charge of government? Should we refuse to go into positions of power, given the corruption involved? Should we be more radical? Or should we dirty our hands, to use the language of political ethics, because that may be necessary to get something done, which of course lets them into all of the limitations and corruption of incrementalism, malignant normality, and so on. How can we advise them better on this point, knowing that there are costs and opportunities on both sides, and that while there may be a need for us to sometimes take a more radical position, there may also be a need to advise those who are not taking a more radical position on how they can better function.
great question.
Let me say, first of all, I think modesty is a good quality. Life is complicated, the world is complicated, and the way it gets back to your question is not all undergraduates have to do the same thing. I also only teach undergraduates now. And they're not all the same. We don't have to tell them to do the same thing. So some may want to be revolutionary, some may want to serve through the existing power structures. There's all kinds of ways to make a contribution to a better future, which we hope for. So I don't see this as a problem. That is, there's going to be lots of avenues for people to make a change, and hopefully they'll be motivated to do one of them.
Okay, I think our time is up, unfortunately, but let's thank the panel, and then Dennis Thompson is going to, who is Mr. Professional Ethics, is going
Doctor
to
professional ethics.
doctor, right, her doctor, professor of professional ethics, is going to tell us what we've said. He's going to categorize it and really make it very neat and explicable, and then we'll have some final conversation, I think, open floor.